पहले इधर देखते हैं. This is the United Nations logo. The emblem has a world map with the olive branches around it, signifying the world peace. In this chapter, we shall discuss the role of international organizations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We shall examine how in this emerging world there were calls for the restructuring of international organizations to cope with the various new challenges, including the rise of US power. The potential reform of the United Nations Security Council is an interesting case of the reform process and its difficulties. We then turn to India's involvement in the UN and its view of Security Council reforms. The chapter closes by asking if the UN can play any role in dealing with the world dominated by one superpower. In this chapter, we shall also look at some other transnational organizations that are playing a crucial role. Now, that's what they say about the parliament too are talking shops. Does it mean that we need talking shops? Here we will be talking about why international organizations. Read the two cartoons on this page. Both the cartoons comment on the ineffectiveness of the United Nations organization, usually referred to as the UN. In the Lebanon crisis in 2006, both the cartoons represent the kind of opinions that we often hear about the UN. On the other hand, we also find that the UN is generally regarded as the most important international organizations in today's world. In the eyes of many people all over the world, it is indispensable and represents the great hope of humanity for the peace and progress. Why do we then need organizations like the UN? Let us hear two incidents. The United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven, but to save it from the hell. Dag Hammarskjöld ने the UN सेकेंड सेक्रेटरी जनरल ने ये बात कही है. इसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है इधर देखते हैं. पहले फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल ये ड्यूरिंग जून 2006 इजराइल अटैक्ड लेबनॉन सेइंग दैट इट वाज नेसेसरी टू कंट्रोल द मिलिटेंट ग्रुप कॉल्ड Hezbollah. Large numbers of civilians were killed and many public buildings and even residential areas came under the Israeli bombardments. The UN passed a resolution on this only in August, and the Israel army withdrew from the region only in the October. Both these cartoons comment on the role of the UN and its Secretary General in this episode. So the United Nations was not created to take humanity to heaven but to save it from the hell. डैग हैमर्सजोल्ड ने बोली थी ये बात, द यूएन सेक्रेटरी जनरल ने. उसके बाद नेक्स्ट जो है वो है टॉकिंग शॉप्स. यस, देयर आर अ लॉट ऑफ स्पीचेस एंड मीटिंग्स एट द यूएन, especially during the annual sessions of the General Assembly. But as Churchill put it, Joe is better than the war. Isn't it better to have one place where all the countries in the world can get together, bore each other, sometimes with their words, rather than bore holes into each other on the battlefield? शशि थरूर ने ये बात बोली थी. द फॉर्मर यूएन अंडर सेक्रेटरी जनरल फॉर द कम्युनिकेशंस एंड पब्लिक इंफॉर्मेशन. These two quotes suggest something important. International organizations are not the answer to everything, but they are important. International organizations helps with the matters of war and peace, and they also help countries cooperate to make the better living conditions for us all. Countries have conflicts and differences with each other. That does not necessarily mean that must go to war to deal with their antagonisms. They can instead discuss contentious issues and find peace solutions. Indeed, even though this is rarely noticed, most conflicts and differences are resolved without going to war, and the role of an international organization can be important in this context. An international organization is not a super state with the authority over its members. It is created by and responds to states. It comes into being when states agree to its creation. Once created, it can help member states resolve their problems peacefully. International organizations are helpful in any another way. Nations can usually see that there are some things they must do together. There are issues that are so challenging that they can only be dealt with when everyone works together. Disease is an example. Some diseases can only be eradicated if everyone in the world cooperates in inoculating or vaccinating their populations. Or take global warming and its effects. As temperatures rise because of the increase in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, there is a danger that sea levels will also rise, thereby submerging many coastal areas of the world, including huge cities. Of course, each country can try to find its own solution to the effects of global warming. But in the end, a more effective approach is to stop the warming itself. This requires at least all of the major industrial powers to cooperate. Unfortunately, recognizing the need for the cooperation and actually cooperating are two different things. Nations can recognize the needs to cooperate but cannot always agree on how best to do so, how to share the costs of cooperating, how to make sure that the benefits of cooperating are justly divided, and how to ensure that others do not break their end of the bargain and cheat on an agreement. An international organization can help produce information and ideas about how to cooperate it. It can provide mechanisms, rules, and a bureaucracy to help the members have more confidence that costs will be shared properly. अब इधर जो है देखो IMF क्या है. IMF is the International Monetary Fund. IMF is an international international organization that oversees those financial institutions and regulations that act in the international level, and the IMF has 190 member countries as on February 2024, 19 February 2024 के according, but they do not enjoy an equal say. The G7 members: US 16.52%, Japan 6.15%, Germany 5.32%, France 4.03%, UK 4.03%, Italy 3.02%, and Canada 2.22% have 41.29% of the votes. China 6.09%, India 2.64%, Russia 2.59%, Brazil 2.22%, and Saudi Arabia 2.02% are the other major members. Now make a list of issues or problems other than the ones mentioned in this text that cannot be handled by any one country and require an international organization. इधर हम क्या बात कर रहे थे? It can provide mechanisms, rules, and bureaucracy to help the members have more confidence that costs will be shared properly, that the benefits will be fairly divided, and that once a member joins an agreement, it will honor the terms and conditions of the agreement. Okay? With the end of the Cold War, we can see that the UN may have a slightly different role, as the United States and its allies emerged victorious, and there was concern amongst many governments and peoples that the Western countries led by the US would be so powerful that there would be no check against their wishes and desires. Can the UN serve to promote dialogue and discussion with the US in particular, and could it limit the power of the American government? We shall try to answer the questions at the end of this chapter. Now see the United Nations की जो founding dates हैं, तो 1941 अगस्त में signing of the Atlantic Charter by the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British PM Winston S. Churchill. 1942 जनवरी में क्या हुआ था? 26 allied nations fighting against the Axis powers meet in the Washington DC to support the Atlantic Charter and sign the declaration by the United Nations. 1943 December में Tehran Conference Declaration of the Three Powers US, Britain and Soviet Union. 1945 February में Yalta Conference of the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin decides to organize a United Nations conference on the proposed world organization. April May the 2-month-long United Nations Conference on the International Organization at San Francisco. 1945 June 26 May signing of the UN Charter by 15 nations. Poland signed on October 15. So the UN has 51 original founding members. 1945 October 24 में क्या हुआ था? The UN was founded. Hence October 24 is celebrated as UN Day. 1945 October 30 में क्या हुआ था? India joins the UN. ठीक है, इधर जो है ये क्या है? Evolution of the UN. So the First World War encouraged the world to invest in an international organization to deal with the conflict. Many believed that such an organization would help the world to avoid the war. As a result, the League of Nations was born. However, despite its initial success, it could not prevent the Second World War 1939 to 1945. Many more died and were wounded in this war than ever before. The UN was founded as the successor to the League of the Nations. It was established in the 1945 immediately after the Second World War, and the organization was set up through the signing of the United Nations Charter by 51 states. It tried to achieve what the League could not between the two world wars. The UN's objective is to prevent international conflict and to facilitate cooperation among the states. It was founded with the hope that it would act to stop the conflicts between the states escalating into the war, and if war broke out, to limit the extent of hostilities. Furthermore, since conflicts often arose from the lack of the social and economic developments, the UN was intended to bring countries together to improve the prospects of the social and economic developments all over the world. By 2011, the UN had 193 member states, and these included almost all independent states in the UN General Assembly. All members have one vote each. In the UN Security Council, there are 5 permanent members. These are the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China, and these states were selected as permanent members as they were the most powerful immediately after the Second World War, and because they constituted the victors in the war. And the UN's most visible public figure and the representative head is the Secretary General. The present Secretary General is Antonio Guterres. He is the 9th Secretary General of the UN. He took over as the Secretary General on 1 January 2017. He was the Prime Minister of Portugal 1995 to 2002 and the UN High Commissioner for the Refugees 2005 to 2015. The UN consists of many different structures and agencies. War and peace and differences between the member states are discussed in the General Assembly as well as the Security Council. Social and economic issues are dealt with by many many agencies, including the World Health Organization's WHO, the United Nations Development Program UNDP, the United Nations Human Rights Commission UNHRC, and the United Nations High Commission for the Refugees UNHCR, and the United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization UNESCO, among the others. ये क्या है, सर्च फॉर एटलीस्ट वन न्यूज आइटम्स अबाउट द एक्टिविटीज ऑफ ईच ऑफ द यूएन एजेंसीज मेंशन्ड ऑन दिस पेज। एंड इधर क्या है, कोल्ड वॉर और नो कोल्ड वॉर, वन रिफॉर्म इज needed above all, only democratic leaders should be allowed to represent their countries in the UN, how can they allow dictators to speak in the name of the people of their own country। इधर जो है ये क्या थी चीज़ें, ये द यूएस ऑफिस ऑफ वॉर इंफॉर्मेशन क्रिएटेड द अबव पोस्टर ड्यूरिंग द सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर एज पर द declaration by the United Nations of 1942, and the poster features the flags of all the nations that were part of the Allied forces. It reflects the belligerent origins of the UN। उसके बाद नेक्स्ट जो है ये क्या है, द यूनाइटेड नेशन सिस्टम प्रिंसिपल ऑर्गन सबसे पहले हम बात करते हैं सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल की। 15 मेंबर्स, 5 परमानेंट विद विटो राइट्स, 10 इलेक्टेड बाय द जनरल असेंबली फॉर द 2-year टर्म्स, डिसीजंस बाइंडिंग ऑन ऑल द यूएन मेंबर्स। इंटरनेशनल कोर्ट ऑफ जस्टिस, 15 जजेस इलेक्टेड फॉर 9 years बाय एब्सोल्यूट मेजोरिटी इन बोथ द जनरल असेंबली एंड द सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल बेस्ड इन दी हैग्यू। उसके बाद सेक्रेटरीट कौन है, इंटरनेशनल स्टाफ सर्विसिंग दी other principal organs headed by the Secretary General, who is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council for a 5-year renewable term। उसके बाद नेक्स्ट जो है वो कौन है, जनरल असेंबली में रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स ऑफ ऑल 193 मेंबर स्टेट्स ईच विद 1 वोट, मेजर डिसीजंस रिक्वायर अ 2/3 मेजोरिटी, अदरवाइज अ सिंपल मेजोरिटी डिसीजंस नॉट बाइंडिंग ऑन द यूएन मेंबर्स। उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, इकोनॉमिक एंड सोशल काउंसिल, मेंबर स्टेट्स इलेक्टेड बाय द जनरल असेंबली फॉर ओवरलैपिंग 3-year टर्म्स, 54 सीट्स आर बेस्ड ऑन द जियोग्राफिक रिप्रेजेंटेशन। इधर क्या है, ट्रस्टीशिप काउंसिल में सस्पेंडेड ऑन 1 November 1994 विद द इंडिपेंडेंस ऑफ पलाऊ, द लास्ट यूएन ट्रस्ट टेरिटरी। इधर जो है ये क्या है, नेक्स्ट सब्सिडरी बॉडीज, एग्जाम्पल है मिलिट्री स्टाफ कमेटी, इंटरनेशनल क्रिमिनल ट्रिब्यूनल्स, फॉर्मर यूगोस्लेविया, रवांडा, पीस कीपिंग ऑपरेशंस एंड मिशंस। रिलेटेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में क्या है, इंटरनेशनल एटॉमिक एनर्जी एजेंसी IAEA रिपोर्ट्स टू बोथ द सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल एंड द जनरल असेंबली। प्रोग्राम्स एंड फंड्स, एग्जाम्पल कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑन द ट्रेड एंड डेवलपमेंट UNCTAD, एनवायरमेंट प्रोग्राम UNEP, डेवलपमेंट प्रोग्राम UNDP, चिल्ड्रंस फंड यूनिसेफ, पॉपुलेशन फंड UNFPA, ऑफिस ऑफ द हाई कमिश्नर फॉर द रिफ्यूजीज UNHCR, वर्ल्ड फूड प्रोग्राम WFP, रिलीफ एंड वर्क्स एजेंसी फॉर द पैलेस्टाइन रिफ्यूजीज इन द नियर ईस्ट UNWRA, ह्यूमन सेटलमेंट्स प्रोग्राम। फंक्शनल कमीशंस में एग्जांपल ह्यूमन राइट्स, नारकोटिक ड्रग्स, सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट, स्टेटस ऑफ वीमेन। रीजनल कमीशंस में इकोनॉमिक कमीशंस फॉर अफ्रीका, यूरोप, लैटिन अमेरिका एंड द कैरिबियन, इकोनॉमिक एंड सोशल कमीशंस फॉर द एशिया एंड द पैसिफिक वेस्टर्न एशिया। इधर जो है ये क्या है, रिसर्च एंड ट्रेनिंग इंस्टीट्यूट्स में एग्जांपल रिसर्च इंस्टीट्यूट्स फॉर द सोशल डेवलपमेंट UNRISD। इधर जो है ये क्या है, सब्सिडरी बॉडीज में कमिटीज एंड एडहॉक बॉडीज। रिलेटेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में एग्जांपल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन फॉर द प्रोहिबिशन ऑफ केमिकल वेपन्स OPCW। इधर जो है रिलेटेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन वर्ल्ड ट्रेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन WTO है। उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, नेक्स्ट जो है इधर अदर एंटाइटीज में एग्जांपल ऑफिस ऑफ द हाई कमिश्नर फॉर द ह्यूमन राइट्स OHCHR and UN University, UNU, joint programs on HIV AIDS UNAIDS। और स्पेशलाइज्ड एजेंसीज में क्या है, नॉन सब्सिडरी में एग्जांपल इंटरनेशनल लेबर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ILO, फूड एंड एग्रीकल्चरल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन FAO, एजुकेशनल साइंटिफिक एंड कल्चरल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन UNESCO, वर्ल्ड हेल्थ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन WHO, वर्ल्ड बैंक ग्रुप, इंटरनेशनल मॉनेटरी फंड IMF, इंटरनेशनल मैरीटाइम ऑर्गेनाइजेशन IMO, वर्ल्ड मेट्रोलॉजिकल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन WMO, इंटरनेशनल टेलीकम्युनिकेशंस यूनियन ITU। ये क्या है, ये फॉर द रीजंस ऑफ द स्पेस द लिस्ट ऑफ द ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस इज सिलेक्टिव। द वर्ल्ड ट्रेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इज द ओनली रिलेटेड बॉडी दैट हैज नो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल लिंक्स टू द UN एट ऑल। इधर क्या है, नेक्स्ट indicates a direct reporting line to and or appointment by indicates a non-subsidiary relationships, indicates the unique status of the Security Council. It is controlled by the veto powers of the unelected permanent 5 मेंबर्स। उसके बाद हम क्या बात कर रहे हैं, इधर जो नेक्स्ट है रिफॉर्म्स ऑफ द UN आफ्टर द कोल्ड वॉर। सो रिफॉर्म एंड इम्प्रूवमेंट आर द फंडामेंटल टू एनी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन टू सर्व द नीड्स ऑफ अ चेंजिंग एनवायरमेंट एंड द UN is no exception. In recent years there have been demands for the reforms of the world body. However, there is little clarity and consensus on the nature of reform. Two basic kinds of reforms face the UN: reform of the organization structure and processes, and a review of the issues that fall within the jurisdiction of the organization. Almost everyone is agreed that both aspects of reforms are necessary. What they cannot agree on is precisely what is to be done, how it's to be done, and when it's to be done. On the reform of structures and processes, the biggest discussion has been on the functioning of the Security Council. Related to this has been the demand for an increase in the UN Security Council's permanent and non-permanent membership, so that the realities of contemporary world politics are better reflected in the structure of the organization. In particular, there are proposals to increase the membership from the Asia, Africa, and South America. Beyond this, the US and the other Western countries want improvements in the UN's budgetary procedures and its administration. on the issues to be given greater priority or to be brought within the jurisdiction of the UN. Some countries and experts want the organization to play a greater or more effective role in peace and security missions, while others want its role to be confined to development and humanitarian work, health, education, environment, population control, human rights, gender, and social justice. Let us look at the both sides of the reforms with an emphasis on the reform of the structures and process. The UN was established in 1945 immediately after the Second World War, and the way I am good, thank you. इधर जो है ये क्या है, ये यूएन सेक्रेटरीज जनरल, इसकी अगर हम बात करें तो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल जो है ये क्या है, ट्राइगवे लाई 1946-1952 नॉर्वे लॉयर एंड फॉरेन मिनिस्टर वर्कड फॉर द सीज फायर बिटवीन इंडिया एंड पाकिस्तान ऑन कश्मीर, क्रिटिसाइज्ड फॉर हिज फेलियर टू क्विकली एंड द कोरियन वॉर, सोवियत यूनियन अपोज्ड सेकेंड टर्म फॉर हिम, रिजाइन फ्रॉम द पोस्ट. इधर जो है ये क्या है, ये डेग हम्बर्सजोल्ड 1953-1961 स्वीडन इकोनॉमिस्ट एंड लॉयर, worked for the resolving the Suez Canal disputes and the decolonization of the Africa, awarded Nobel Peace स्वेज कैनाल डिस्प्यूट्स एंड द डिकोलोनाइजेशन. बस इतनी सुबह ही मेरे को टाइम मिलता है, फिर उसके बाद मेरे को मिलता नहीं है टाइम, ठीक है. डेग हैमर्सजोल्ड 1953-1961 स्वीडन में इकोनॉमिस्ट एंड लॉयर, वर्कड फॉर द रिजॉल्विंग द स्वेज कैनाल डिस्प्यूट्स एंड द डिकोलोनाइजेशन ऑफ अफ्रीका, अवॉर्डेड नोबेल पीस प्राइज posthumously in 1961 for his efforts to settle the Congo crisis. Soviet Union and France criticized his role in Africa. Youth Hunt में 1961 to 1971 में क्या है, बर्मा, म्यांमार, टीचर एंड डिप्लोमेट, वर्क फॉर द रिजॉल्विंग द क्यूबान मिसाइल्स क्राइसिस एंड एंडिंग द Congo crisis, established the UN peacekeeping force in the Cyprus, criticized the US during the Vietnam War. Kurt Waldheim 1972 to 1981 क्या है, Australia diplomat and foreign minister, made efforts to resolve the problems of Namibia and Lebanon, oversaw the relief operation in Bangladesh. China blocked his bid for a third term. Jovit Perez de Cuellar 1982 to 1991, Peru lawyer and diplomat, worked for peace in Cyprus, Afghanistan, and E.I. Salvador, mediated between the Britain and Argentina after the Falklands War, and negotiated for the independence of the Namibia. ये क्या नेक्स्ट है, बॉर्डर्स घाली 1992 to 1996, Egypt diplomat, jurist, foreign minister, issued a report on an agency for the peace, conducted a successful UN operation in the Mozambique, blamed for the UN failures in Bosnia, Somalia. Thank you. UN failures in Bosnia, Somalia, and Rwanda. Due to the serious disagreements, the US blocked a second term for him. And Kofi A. Annan, 1997 to 2006, Ghana, UN official, created the Global Fund to fight the AIDS, tuberculosis as an illegal vote, established for the Peace Building Commission and the Human Rights Council in 2005, awarded for the 2001 Nobel Peace Prize. Ban Ki-moon, 2007 to 2016, Republic of Korea, South Korea, diplomat and foreign minister, the second Asian to hold the post, highlighted climate change, focused on the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, worked for the creation of the UN Women, emphasized the conflicts resolution and nuclear disarmament. Antonio Manuel de Oliveira Guterres, 2017, Portugal, former Prime Minister of Portugal from 1995 to 2002, was the United Nations High Commissioner for the Refugees during 2005 to 2015, President of the Socialist International from 1999 to 2005. He is serving as the 9th Secretary General of the United Nations. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, इधर ये बन की मून यूएन सेक्रेटरी जनरल लॉन्चेस यूएन एट 70 टू सेलिब्रेट द 70th एनिवर्सरी इन न्यू दिल्ली इन 2015. यूएन फोटो या मार्क गार्टन ये सब दिए गए हैं. इधर हम बात कर रहे थे, द यूएन वॉज एस्टेब्लिश्ड इन 1945 इमीडिएटली आफ्टर द सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर, एंड द वे इट वॉज ऑर्गेनाइज्ड and the way it functioned reflected the realities of world politics after the Second World War. After the Cold War, those realities are different. Here are some of the changes that have occurred. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and उसके बाद the US is the strongest power, and the relationship between the Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, and the US is the much more cooperative, and China is fast emerging as a great power, and India also is growing rapidly. The economies of Asia are growing at an unprecedented rate. Many new countries have joined the UN as they became independent from the Soviet Union or former communist states in Eastern Europe. A whole new set of challenges confronts the world: genocide, civil war, ethnic conflict, terrorist, nuclear proliferation, climate change, environmental degradation, epidemics. In this situation in 1989, as the Cold War was ending, the question facing the world was, is the UN doing enough? Is it equipped to do what is required? What should it be doing, and how? What reforms are necessary to make it work better? For the past decade and half, member states have been trying to find satisfactory and practical answers to these questions. उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है? Reform of structures and process. While the case for the reforms has widespread support, getting agreement on what to do is difficult. Let us examine the debate over reforms of the UN Security Council in 1992. The UN General Assembly adopted a resolution. The resolution reflected three main complaints. The Security Council no longer represents contemporary political realities. Its decisions reflects only Western values and interests and are dominated by the few powers. It lacks equitable representation in view of these growing demands for the restructuring of the UN on 1 January 1997, and the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan initiated an inquiry into how the UN should be reformed and how, for instance, should new Security Council members be chosen. In the years since then, the following are just some of the criteria that have been proposed for the new permanent and non-permanent members of the Security Council. A new member, it has been suggested, should be a major economic power, a major military power, a substantial contributor to the UN budget, and a big nation in terms of its population, a nation that respects democracy and human rights, a country that would make the council more representative of the world's diversity in terms of geography, economic systems, and culture. ठीक है, इधर क्या दे रखा है, मेजर कंट्रीब्यूटर्स टू द यूएन रेगुलर बजट फॉर 2019 में. इधर जो है ये क्या है, यूएसए, चाइना, जापान, जर्मनी, यूके, फ्रांस, इटली, ब्राजील, कनाडा, रशिया, रिपब्लिक ऑफ कोरिया, ऑस्ट्रेलिया, स्पेन, टर्की, नेदरलैंड्स, मैक्सिको, सऊदी अरबिया, स्विट्जरलैंड, अर्जेंटीना, स्वीडन, इंडिया. इन सबका जो है मेजर कंट्रीब्यूशन टू द यूएन रेगुलेटरी बजट फॉर द 2019 इस वाले टाइम का जो है दिखाया गया है कि किसने कितना जो है कंट्रीब्यूट किया है. ठीक है, उसके बाद नेक्स्ट जो है ये क्या है, वर्ल्ड बैंक. वर्ल्ड बैंक क्या होता है, द वर्ल्ड बैंक वॉज क्रिएटेड ड्यूरिंग द सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर इन 1944. इट्स एक्टिविटीज आर फोकस्ड ऑन द डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज. इट वर्क्स फॉर द ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट, जैसे कि हो गया एजुकेशन, हेल्थ, एग्रीकल्चर एंड रूरल डेवलपमेंट, इरिगेशन, रूरल सर्विसेज, एनवायरमेंटल प्रोटेक्शन, पॉल्यूशन रिडक्शन, एस्टेब्लिशिंग एंड एनफोर्सिंग रेगुलेशंस, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर, roads, urban regeneration, electricity and governance, anti-corruption, developments of legal institutions. It provides loans and grants to the members countries. This way it exercises enormous influence on the economic policies of developing countries. It is often criticized for the setting the economic agenda of the poorer nations, attaching stringent conditions to its loans and forcing free markets reform. इधर क्या है ये, clearly each of these criteria has some validity. Governments saw advantages in some criteria and disadvantages in other depending on their interest and aspirations. Even if they had no desire to be members themselves, countries could see that the criteria were problematic. How big an economic or military power did you have to be qualified for the Security Council membership? What level of budget contributions would enable a state to buy its way into the council? Was a big population an asset or a liability for a country trying to play a bigger role in the world? If respect for the democracy and human rights was the criteria, countries with excellent records would be in line to be the members, but would they be effective as council members? उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो क्या है, नेक्स्ट जो है इधर जो है एक एक्टिविटी के लिए स्टेप्स दे रखे हैं. स्कूल में क्या किया जा सकता है, डिवाइड द क्लास इनटू 6 ग्रुप्स. ईच ग्रुप इज टू फॉलो वन ऑफ द 6 क्राइटेरिया और मोर इफ देयर आर मोर सजेशंस लिस्टेड हियर फॉर द परमानेंट मेंबरशिप ऑफ द यूएन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल. ईच ग्रुप इज टू मेक इट्स ओन लिस्ट ऑफ द परमानेंट मेंबर्स बेस्ड ऑन इट्स गिवन क्राइटेरिया. एग्जाम्पल, द ग्रुप वर्किंग ऑन द पॉपुलेशन क्राइटेरिया विल बी फाइंड आउट द विच आर द 5 मोस्ट पॉपुलस कंट्रीज एंड ईच ग्रुप कैन मेक अ प्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ देयर रिकमेंडेशन लिस्ट एंड रीजंस व्हाई देयर क्राइटेरिया शुड बी एक्सेप्टेड. ठीक है, उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है वो है आइडियाज फॉर द teacher. Allow the students to opt for the group whose criterion they themselves favor and compare all the lists and see how many names are common and how often India features, and keep some time for an open-ended discussions on which criterion should be adopted. तो ये टीचर एंड स्टूडेंट एक्टिविटीज दे रखी हैं. उसके बाद जो नेक्स्ट है इस चैप्टर में क्या है, फर्दर मोर हाउ वॉज द मैटर ऑफ रिप्रेजेंटेशन टू बी रिजॉल्व एंड डिड इक्विटेबल रिप्रेजेंटेशन इन जियोग्राफिकल terms mean that there should be one seat each from the Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean. Should the representation United Nations. This is an international organization for maintaining peace in the world. ठीक है, लेटिन अमेरिका एंड द कैरिबियन क्या है ये, शुड द रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑन द अदर हैंड बी बाय रीजन्स और सब रीजन्स रादर देन कॉन्टिनेंट्स. व्हाई शुड द इशू ऑफ इक्विटेबल रिप्रेजेंटेशन बी डिसाइडेड बाय ज्योग्राफी, व्हाई नॉट बाय लेवल्स ऑफ इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट, व्हाई नॉट इन अदर वर्ड्स गिव मोर सीट्स टू द मेंबर्स ऑफ द डेवलपिंग वर्ल्ड. इवन हियर देयर आर difficulties. The developing world consisting of countries at many different levels of the development. What about the cultures? Should different cultures or civilizations be given representation in a more balanced way? How does one divide the world by civilizations or cultures given that nations have so many culture streams within their borders? A related issue was to change the nature of membership altogether. Some insisted, for instance, that the veto power of the 5 permanent members be abolished. Many perceived the veto to be in the conflict with the concept of democracy and sovereign equality in the UN, and thought that the veto was no longer right or relevant. In the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members, and the Charter gave the permanent members a privileged position to bring about the stability in the world after the Second World War, and the main privileges of the 5 permanent members are permanency and the veto power, and the non-permanent members serve for the only 2 years at a time and give way after that period. The newly elected members, a country cannot be re-elected immediately after the completing a term of 2 years, and the non-permanent members are elected in a manner so that they represent all continents of the world. And उसके बाद जो next है वो क्या है? Most importantly, the non-permanent members do not have the veto power. What is the veto power? In taking decisions, the Security Council proceeds by voting. All members have one vote. However, the permanent members can vote in a negative manner, so that even if all the other permanent members and non-permanent members vote for a particular decision, any permanent member's negative vote can stall the decision, and this negative vote is known as veto. This is known as what? Veto. While there has been a move to abolish or modify the veto system, there is also a realization that the permanent members are unlikely to agree to such a reform. Also, the world may not be ready for such a radical step, even though the Cold War is over. Without the veto, there is a danger, as in 1945, that the great powers would lose interest in the world body, that they would do what they pleased outside it, and that without their support and involvement, the body would be ineffective. Use of veto power by permanent members अप टू 1 जून 2018. चाइना का दिख रहा है 11 है, फ्रांस का 18 है, यूके का 32 है, यूएसए का 84 है, एंड यूएसएसआर या रशिया का 135. दिस इज व्हाट? दिस इज मतलब एक पाई चार्ट में आपको एक डायग्राम के थ्रू जो समझाया गया कि इसका कितना रोल था, ठीक है, इन 2018 में, जून 1 2018 के अकॉर्डिंग. इसके बाद ये जो बच्ची है वो सरप्राइज हो रही है. दैट इज़ वेरी अनफेयर. इट्स एक्चुअली द वीकर कंट्रीज हु नीड अ वीटो, नॉट दोज हु ऑलरेडी हैव सो मच पावर. फाइंड आउट अबाउट द सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट SDGs गोल्स. ये क्या होते हैं? नाउ लेट्स टॉक अबाउट द ज्यूरिसडिक्शन ऑफ द यूएन का ज्यूरिसडिक्शन के बारे में. सो द क्वेश्चन ऑफ द मेंबरशिप इज अ सीरियस वन. इन एडिशन, दो देयर more substantial issues before the world, as the UN completed 60 years of its existence. The heads of all the member states met in September 2005 to celebrate the anniversary and review the situation. And the leaders in this meeting decided that the following steps should be taken to make the UN more relevant in the changing context. Creation of a peace building commission, acceptance of the responsibility of the international community in case of failures of the national governments to protect their own citizens from the atrocities. Establishment of a Human Rights Council operational since 19 June 2006. Agreements to achieve the Millennium Development Goals MDGs, and condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Creation of a democracy fund, and agreement to wind up the trusteeship council. It is not hard to see that these are equally contentious issues for the UN. What should be a peaceful building commission do? There are many numbers of conflicts all over the world. Which one should it intervene in? Is it possible or even desirable for it to intervene in each and every conflict? And similarly, what is the responsibility of the international community in dealing with the atrocities? What are the human rights, and who should determine the level of the human rights violations and the course of actions to be taken when they are violated? Given that so many countries are still part of the developing world, how realistic is it for the UN to achieve an ambitious set of goals such as those listed in the Sustainable Development Goals? Can there be agreement on a definition of terrorism? How shall the UN use funds to promote the democracy, and so on? इधर ये क्या दिखा रखा है? This is a big helping of words. ये Darfur, the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, Sudan, since 2003 has attracted empty promises by the international community. How do you think that the UN can intervene in situations like this? Would that require a change in the jurisdiction? इधर क्या है? यूनाइटेड नेशंस पीस कीपिंग ऑपरेशंस. ये क्या है? मतलब इसके पता नहीं कौन से शब्द हैं ये, विच आई कैन नोट मतलब स्पीक अप. सो इसकी जो है बस पिक्चर देखी जा सकती है. एंड देन वी आर गोइंग टू डिस्कस अबाउट द WTO. दिस इज वर्ल्ड ट्रेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन. वर्ल्ड ट्रेड ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इज एन इंटरनेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन विच सेट्स द रूल्स फॉर द ग्लोबल ट्रेड. द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन वाज सेट अप इन 1995 as a successor to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, that is GATT. Created after the Second World War, it has 164 members as on 29 July 2016. All decisions are taken unanimously, but the major economic powers such as the US, European Union, and Japan have managed to use the WTO to frame the rules of trade to advance their own interests. The developing countries often complain of non-transparent procedures and being pushed around by the big powers. ठीक है, इधर जो है ये, do we want to oppose the bossing of the big five, or do we want to join them and become the another boss? इधर जो है ये क्या है? India and the UN reforms we are going to discuss. So इधर क्या है ये? India has supported the restructuring of the UN on the several grounds. It believes that a strengthened and revitalized UN is desirable in changing world. India also supports an enhanced role for the UN in promoting development and cooperation among the states. India believes that development should be central to the UN's agenda, as it is a vital precondition for the maintenance of the international peace and security. One of India's major concerns has been the composition of the Security Council, which has remained largely static while the UN General Assembly membership has expanded considerably. India considers that this has harmed around the representative character of the Security Council, it also urges that an expanded council with more representation will enjoy greater support in the world community. We should keep in mind that the membership of the UN Security Council was expanded from 11 to 15 in 1965, but there was no change in the number of permanent members. Since then, the size of the council has remained stationary, and the fact remains that the overwhelming majority of the UN General Assembly members now are developing countries, and therefore India argues that they should also have a role in shaping the decisions in the Security Council which affect them. India supports an increase in the number of the both permanent and non-permanent members. Its representatives have argued that the activities of the Security Council have greatly expanded in the past few years, and the success of the Security Council's actions depends upon the political support of the international community. Any plan for the restructuring of any Security Council should therefore be Okay, bye. The success of the Security Council's actions depends upon the political support of the international community. Any plan for the restructuring of the Security Council should therefore be broad. For example, the Security Council should have more developing countries in it. Not surprisingly, India itself also wishes to be a permanent member in a restructured UN. India is the most populous country in the world, comprising almost one-fifth of the world population. Moreover, India is also the world's largest democracy. India has participated in virtually all the initiatives of the UN. Its role in the UN peacekeeping efforts is a long and substantial one, and the country's economic emergence on the world stage is another factor that perhaps justifies India's claim to be a permanent seat in the Security Council. India has also made regular financial contributions to the UN and never faltered on its payments. India is aware that permanent membership of the Security Council also has symbolic importance. It signifies a country's growing importance in world affairs. This greater status is an advantage to a country in the conduct of its foreign policy, and the reputation for being powerful makes you more influential. ठीक है इधर क्या है ये IAEA the International Atomic Energy Agency IAEA was established in 1957. It came into being to implement US President Dwight Eisenhower Atoms for Peace proposal. It seeks to promote the peaceful use of the nuclear energy and to prevent its use for military purposes. IAEA teams regularly inspect nuclear facilities all over the world to ensure that civilian reactors are not being used for the military purposes. इधर जो है नेक्स्ट क्या है ये इधर जो नेक्स्ट है ये है व्हाट हैपेंस इफ द यूएन इनवाइट समवन टू न्यूयॉर्क बट द यूएस डज नॉट इशू वीज़ा इधर जो है क्या है ये एमनेस्टी इंटरनेशनल इज एन NGO that campaigns for the protection of human rights all over the world. It promotes respect for all the human rights in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. It believes that human rights are interdependent and indivisible. It prepares and publishes reports on the human rights. Governments are not always happy with these reports, since a major focus of Amnesty is the misconduct of the government authorities. Nevertheless, these reports play an important role in research and advocacy on the human rights. ये क्या दिखा रखा है if the right one don't get you then the left one will. ये है UN. if the right one don't get you UN or then the left one will. ये war ठीक है ये जो है एक पिक्चर है. Now let's talk about the UN in a unipolar world. ये जो UN है इन दी यूनिपोलर वर्ल्ड ये हो गया था डिस्पाइट इंडिया विश टू बी परमानेंट विटो बिल्डिंग मेंबर ऑफ द UN, some countries questions its inclusion. Neighboring Pakistan, with which India has troubled relations, it is not the only country that is reluctant to see India become a permanent veto member of the Security Council. Some countries, for instance, are concerned about India's nuclear weapons capabilities. Others think that its difficulties with Pakistan will make India ineffective as a permanent member. Yet others feel that if India is included, then other emerging powers will have to be accommodated, such as Brazil, Germany, Japan, perhaps even South Africa, whom they oppose. They are those who feel that Africa and South America must be represented in any expansion of the permanent membership, since those are the only continents not to have representation in the present structure. Given these concerns, it may not be very easy for the India or anyone else to become a permanent member of the UN in the near future. The UN in the unipolar world. Among the concerns about the reform and restructuring of the UN has been the hope of some countries that changes could help the UN cope better with the unipolar world in which the US was the most powerful country without any serious rivals. Can the UN serve as a balance against US dominance? Can it help maintain a dialogue between the rest of the world and the US and prevent America from doing whatever it wants? US power cannot be easily checked. First of all, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the US stands as the only superpower. Its military and economic power allow it to ignore the UN or any other international organization. Secondly, within the UN, the influence of the US is considerable. As the single largest contributor to the UN, and the US has unmatched. The UN is physically located within the US territory, gives Washington additional sources of influence. The US also has many nationals in the UN bureaucracy. In addition, with the veto power, the US can stop any moves that it finds annoying or damaging to its interests or the interests of its friends and allies. The power of the US and the veto within the organization also ensure that the Washington has a considerable degree of say in the choice of the Secretary General of the UN. The US can and does use the power to split the rest of the world and to reduce the position to its policies. The UN is not therefore a great balance to the US. Nevertheless, in a unipolar world in which the US is dominant, the UN can and has served to bring the US and the rest of the world into the discussions over the various issues. US leaders, in spite of their frequent criticisms of the UN, do see the organization as serving a purpose in the bringing together over 190 nations in dealing with the conflict and social and economic development. As for the rest of the world, the UN provides an arena in which it is possible to modify the US attitudes and policies, while the rest of the world is really united against Washington. And while it is virtually impossible to balance US power, the UN does provide a space within which arguments against specific US attitudes and policies are heard, and compromises and concessions can be shaped. The UN is an imperfect body, but without it, the world would be worse off given the growing connections and links between the societies and issues, what we often call interdependence. It is hard to imagine how more than 7 billion people would live together without an organization such as the UN. Technology promises to increase planetary interdependence, and therefore the importance of the UN will only increase. Peoples and governments will have to find ways of supporting and using the UN and the other international organizations in ways that are consistent with their own interests and the interests of the international community more broadly. Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is another international NGO involved in research and advocacy on the human rights. It is the largest international human rights organization in the US. It draws the global media's attention to human rights abuses. It helped in the building international coalitions like the campaigns to ban the landmines, to stop the use of the child soldiers, and to establish the International Criminal Court.